All right, so we finished our halftime speech. We're moving on into the second half of Hebrews 11. We're going to look at Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. We're back on Abraham. It's normally called the Akedah. Genesis 22 is what we're referencing here when we're looking at Hebrews 11. So let me read it. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. By faith Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Also, again, that comes from Genesis 22. I'm going to read James 1, 2-4 real quick, because that'll help us. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So this Genesis 22 passage, which is talked about in Hebrews 11, is one of the hardest passages to deal with in all of the Old Testament. Scholars have written on it extensively, and if you want to research it, there's just so much that's been written on Genesis 22. What's hard about it is the fact that God would test Abraham by telling him to kill his only son. If you remember, Isaac was the one who was going to receive the promise. Those promises that we looked at earlier, that Abraham was promised by God, God's now telling him to kill the one through who these promises are going to come. And if you think about it, Abraham probably should have said no. Any rational person would say no. It doesn't look like God is making sense here. And of course, we know the end of the story, but it makes no sense if you just read that on its own. That God would tell Abraham to kill the one through whom the promise was going to come. And I'm asking, is that something in our lives as well? You know, there's things in our lives where God isn't making much sense. In a pandemic, God doesn't look like he's making much sense. But again, there's a much larger story than we can see right now. So, if you have faith, it's going to be put to the test. We have to make the distinction here that God himself does not put people to the test. God does not inflict sin, inflict punishment on people. He does inflict punishment, but he doesn't cause people to sin. What he does is he allows temptations, and he allows sin to tempt us so that it produces more faith. He may allow temptations to occur, but he himself does not test people. And you can read that in the Westminster Confession. It talks about that a lot. So Abraham was ready to offer up his only son. That should sound familiar. Bell should be going in your head. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave up his only son. Again, Jesus is the better picture of this sacrifice. And then from Jesus, we become part of the family of God. We've talked about it before we went into quarantine when I did Romans 8. But because of the death of Christ, because of the sacrifice of the Son, we become offspring of Abraham and heirs with Christ. And then verse 19 says, Abraham had faith that God would raise Isaac from the dead. You know, he didn't understand why God told him to put Isaac to death, but he understood that God could raise someone from the dead. And we don't believe this anymore because we live in the West and we live in an age of technology and an age of medicine. We just don't believe this anymore. We don't believe that God, whenever, we say, oh, technology fixed this, oh, medicine fixed this. But in reality, it's all God. Anything that happens in this world is because God is working and because God is healing by his own hand. Though Isaac wasn't literally raised from the dead, Jesus was. Isaac is a figure, a type of what Jesus would be. Jesus is the greater Isaac because he was raised from the dead and because he was the ultimate sacrifice. Sin there has to be a punishment for sin. And in the Old Testament, that was sacrifices. And in the New Testament, Jesus becomes that ultimate sacrifice so that we ourselves wouldn't have to deal with the punishment for our sin. So the application is, Have patience when your faith comes under fire. Look for places where your faith is put to the test. If you are a believer, you should be facing trials. You should be facing persecution. Your faith is going to come under fire. In your relationships, there's going to be temptations to sin physically with your partner. In school, there's going to be temptations to give up. In life, there's going to be temptations to give up. But we have to endure and we have to push on because the testing of our faith produces a steadfastness and an abiding with God. When you are tested, cling to God. Pray, read, fast, and rejoice when God brings you through these trials. And then pray for the faith to stand strong as Abraham did, to trust God. And that's something that we need the Spirit for. So pray that the Spirit would work this kind of faith and this kind of steadfastness in your hearts as we trust God more and more each and every day.